Scott, what does the film and the stats tell you about Jimmy Garoppolo?
I think when you kind of try and look across a broad variety of numbers, the stats in the film match up pretty well. If you cherry pick isolated things, you can create headlines from stats that perhaps don't match the film. But when you look across it quite broadly, you see basically a similar picture of a quarterback who's in that sort of 10 to 15 range, who has some very valuable strengths, but also some notable weaknesses that kind of perhaps limit him from cracking what would that kind of top 5, but certainly shouldn't stop him from, if he makes a few tweaks to his game, cracking kind of the top 10 on a fairly consistent basis.
Okay, so essentially what you were saying is he's an upper level new quarterback, so to speak, second, third year, but he's not trash, definitely, which is what a lot of fans are kind of saying. We've heard a lot of people say in this system, one, almost anyone can have success, and two, going a step above and saying, why is Jimmy in there? Put Nick Mullins in there. What separates Jimmy Garoppolo from Nick Mullins?
I think with Jimmy, it all starts from his mechanics. The way he can kind of generate torque from his hips through to his shoulders gives him basically a very quick release. And that does a couple of things. In the kind of the 49ers under center, drop back pass, play action, offense, Jimmy Garoppolo, when he's making those kind of quick strikes, he's working off 3-step drops. That can create kind of cluttered pockets, pressure in his face, and the fact that he doesn't have to step into throws, the fact that he can throw off unusual bases, which is a product of his mechanics, means that he can continue to execute that kind of quick strike offense that the 49ers like without even with pressure in his face. Whereas Mullins, we saw struggled a little bit in that regard. He isn't quite as willing to stand in there in the face of pressure as Jimmy G. And the other thing that Jimmy G has over Mullins that his mechanics allow him to do is he's just better on the move. That kind of same ability to throw from perhaps unusual throwing bases means that he's good at rolling left, he's good at rolling right, he's better at extending plays and making plays on the run that sort of Nick Mullins can't do. Whereas Nick Mullins can execute some of the more basic elements of this offense. When things start to break down, that's kind of when you see the separation really emerge between those two players. And I think that's what sets Jimmy Garoppolo apart from guys like Jared Goff. So that would be kind of a comparison of perhaps another player that you see who he's fine just executing the kind of the bare bones of the offense. But when things start to go a little bit wrong, that's when kind of the guys really, the difference between quarterbacks can emerge more readily. And Jimmy Garoppolo is certainly superior to Nick Mullins in that regard.
Okay, that's nice to know because, you know, if you were just going based on Twitter replies, you would think they're equal, if not Nick is better. Matt, we watched roughly a year and a half full, or season and a half, I should say, full of Jimmy Garoppolo. Has he exceeded your I'll say that again. Has Jimmy Garoppolo met or exceeded your expectations thus far?
He's been good. I don't want to say great. And, you know, Scott talks about the mechanics. The one area where I think that him not needing to generate that much torque and that really hurts him is in the deep ball. There's almost no weight transfer. And I feel when you're in those intermediate routes that are over the middle between the numbers, that's where he excels. Pinpoint accuracy. He'll put the ball where he needs to. But if you watch him, he doesn't throw down the field outside the numbers. He just doesn't do it. He's not throwing fly routes. He barely throws deep posts, only occasionally. And I think part of that is the further the ball gets away from Jimmy Garoppolo, the more that lack of actually stepping into a throw makes the ball kind of, sail from left to right. As far as Nick Mullins, the proof is in the pudding. Jimmy's better than Nick Mullins. I've always thought Nick Mullins had a noodle arm, and it's pretty apparent when you watch the velocity on their ball. He has almost no zip. So as far as exceeding expectations, I can't really say that. We haven't seen him enough. Wins, he's done a great job. His record speaks for itself. I'd like to see some development from him, though, going forward and taking this team to the next level, because I do think that he does have an extra gear. He just needs the actual playing experience to kind of reach it. Deep ball is a huge concern, and if he can, get that down and clean up some of his questionable decision-making at times, he's going to be there.
The questionable decision-making, I think, is the biggest thing for me. We saw a lot of forced passes, a lot of passes that he just simply should have made. There's no excuse for it. And at the most clutch moments in the game where you need your quarterback at the very least to not turn the ball over, he's either put the ball in danger and harm's way or completely made a turnover. Scott, Matt touched on there his deep ball, which has kind of been his Achilles, so to speak. Statistically speaking, is that something that quarterbacks can improve on as their career kind of goes on, or is it however it is right now? That's the best it's going to be. That's all it's going to be for Jimmy, his deep ball right now.
I think generally speaking, there is kind of a small degree of improvement that you can make in the pros. The general kind of consensus is that accuracy doesn't improve drastically in the pro game when you're sort of from what you were doing in college. And we've seen players improve their deep ball. Lamar Jackson would be an obvious recent example of someone who has improved his deep ball. I believe Aaron Rodgers is someone who's improved his deep ball since coming into the NFL. There are a few examples, but I think these are when you talk about Lamar Jackson, you talk about Aaron Rodgers. These are guys who you could argue have a little bit more arm talent than a Jimmy Garoppolo might have, particularly Aaron Rodgers. So kind of the extent to which we'd be looking for improvement, I don't think it's something we should be relying on. We're talking about outliers here. So it's possible, but I certainly think statistically speaking that the evidence is that it's highly unlikely that he's going to improve it substantially over what it is today.
So essentially, it's just not his game. It's not something that he can go to repeatedly and find success. And I mean, if you're asking me, I think he's in the perfect system to where he's not asked to do that repeatedly, especially to win games. So it's kind of the perfect marriage. Matt, is it the perfect marriage? Because, the 49ers run the ball a lot. He's with arguably the best play caller in the NFL. Would Jimmy have this sort of success with another team?
He might have had it in New England. I mean, Belichick's good at scheming as well. You just got to think about Kyle Shanahan and how talented he is, getting the most out of the talent that he has. And Jimmy Garoppolo is able to, helm this offense well enough to get them to the Super Bowl with no first-round skill talent at any of the skill positions on offense. And now he gets a Brandon Ayuk to kind of, build upon that. And we're going to see Debo year 2. George Kittle again, maybe another step forward, or just being George Kittle will be enough. And once you get the weapons around him, now we're going to see, with experience in Kyle's offense, this is going to be the year that Jimmy either takes a huge step forward or we know what he is. My concern is that if he doesn't improve that deep ball at all, then maybe teams start to scheme to take away the things that he does well. Maybe you shade your zone to the inside, to the hash marks, because Jimmy loves to throw between the numbers. Take away the underneath stuff that Jimmy likes to do. I also think that getting Jet McKinnon, if he can come back as a pass catching back, will be a huge asset. Tevin Coleman led the team last year with 21 catches. And for a Kyle Shanahan offense, that's a small amount of catches for a running back. So with the new weapons around him and a little bit more growth, hopefully Jimmy can take a step forward. So that way, we can say that this is a perfect marriage.
It would be something, definitely an added dimension to this team because, like you said, 21 catches for Tevin Coleman, that's not much for a Kyle Shanahan offense. And you could tell when they originally signed Jet, they were stoked to have him. And it's been 2 years now, and it's like, just letdown after letdown. I really hope he has it in him this year to come back strong. Scott, I have one last question for you here. What's your favorite? I don't even know if you have one. But what's your favorite Jimmy Garoppolo stat? Just if people kind of say he's not a good quarterback or the 49ers should look to move on, what's your go-to that, you can say actually he is, and this is why?
I think it's just his accuracy. I think he's he comes to be top 10, maybe sort of very near top 5 in terms of his PFF adjusted completion percentage. And that's partly a product of the offense and what Kyle's doing, but it is essentially what he is good at. He is very good at. And when you have an offensive mind like Kyle Shanahan, when you have a roster construction like that, which John Lynch has managed to create for him with the likes of Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, the running backs, potentially Jalen Hurd, Brandon Ayuk now, Kendrick Bourne, Trent Taylor, guys that can either uncover quickly and sort of take passes, for 5 or 6 yards a pop, or even just, take a 6-yard pass and turn it into a 25-yard game. That's kind of all you need for him. We just need him, as Matt said, to just look after the ball a bit better, on those underneath routes. Because even if his deep ball doesn't improve, if his awareness of dropping linebackers and things just improves, then suddenly that dink and dunk offense becomes highly efficient. And what we've actually seen is Drew Brees. Like, we've seen him now for the last 3 or 4 years just be a top tier NFL quarterback with dink and dunk offense because he never ever turns the ball over. And if Jimmy Garoppolo can improve his ball security and play in the sort of the dink and dunk, make the throws, hit the right players, then I think we could see Jimmy Garoppolo hit that kind of ceiling because he's so routinely accurate on the underneath stuff.
Well, one thing remains to be seen is that let me restart that. One thing is for sure, Jimmy Garoppolo and the 49ers both have a lot in store for 2020. And even though, look, they went to the Super Bowl last year, 4 or 5 minutes away from winning it, there's still a lot for this team to prove and a lot for each individual player to prove. So it's going to be big for this team, and hopefully they step up to a plate.
Next up on Niners News.
What do you go to look at if a team is successful or not?
I think EPA per play is, or an EPA overall is a very big one. It's basically expected points added. And what it does is it essentially values the extent to which a play improves your chances of scoring points at the end of the drive. And what it tries to do, therefore, is rather than just having kind of saying, the quarterback threw 5 yards, that's a good thing or a bad thing, it takes into account the situation. And if your quarterback throws for 5 yards on 3rd and 10, that's not a good play. But if a quarterback throws for 5 yards on 3rd and 3, then clearly that's a much more improved play. So it just adds a little bit more context. And I think it's a good statistic to determine success. I think you have to look at obviously more things before you start making conclusions. I think the whole kind of run v pass debate, one of the things that's really driven that is EPA and EPA per play more specifically. I think it creates some parameters around the game and some assumptions. For example, like the assumption that teams are trying to score as quickly as possible, therefore they should throw the ball as much as possible to advance the ball as much as possible through the air. We've seen with the 49ers offense, that's not necessarily what you want to be doing. There's teams like the Seahawks as well, teams that back their defense, they want to possess the ball on offense. That doesn't reflect particularly well on teams that do that. It doesn't reflect on teams that want to sort of run the ball at 6 yards a pop, which is more than enough. So it's not perfect, but I think it's just a useful way of, when you kind of look at it, to just differentiate between the teams that are doing at least a reasonable job on offense and the team that are really struggling on offense, and then vice versa on defense.
Okay. So it's essentially just points added given whatever field you're looking at, whatever metric. Matt, same question to you. What stats do you use to determine team stats?
Well, I like the old school methods of statistics. I know about DVOA and the one that Scott just talked about, expected points per play or something, per play added, something like that. Listen, for me, it's old school point differential. How much do you beat your opponent by? And if you look at point differential from this last season, 9 of the top 10 teams were in the playoffs last year, and the 11th team was Philadelphia, and they were in the playoffs. The one lone team out of there was Dallas. They were right there in it at the end. But it matters. How much do you beat teams by? What's your big point differential? Because that tells me that it's, you're dominating. If, it's easy to, we've heard the 20-20 offenses, right? They're great in between, yardage machines. They just take up, field space everywhere. But if you're not scoring points and you're not keeping the opponent from scoring points, it doesn't get much more simple than that.
So simple, just like you said, what are you scoring versus what are you allowing? I got to say, I'm not as involved in depth with these statistics. I'm not a PFF guy. I don't go into it, like a lot of guys do, like Scott probably does. I'm more old school in this terms of run the ball, play good defense. So my, golden rule, I guess, has always been how many points are you allowing? Because it kind of reminds me of like the 2011, 2012 Harbaugh years where, they had Alex Smith back there and he wasn't lighting guys up or teams up, I should say, for 35, 40 points a game. But on the flip side, their defense was allowing like 15 points a game. So not that much was being asked of the offense. So, really, it just goes to strictly how good is your defense at limiting the other team from scoring. Scott, what do these new kind of metrics and statistics of determining success, how does it allow you to get a bigger picture or at least add more context to what maybe more so opposed to how Matt and I view it?
I think that the aim is just that last thing you said, is just they're trying to add more context to kind of the basic raw stats that we have. And I actually think kind of the real kind of advanced metrics, things like DVOA, EPA, sort of more of the algorithmic stuff, is useful to a point, but I think you still have to be consider kind of more just a greater volume of kind of raw stats. Things like, okay, in Jimmy Garoppolo's case that like we were talking about on the previous show, how many deep balls does he throw? That's an interesting question. How does that compare to other players? Like another sort of, it's not an advanced stat, but it's just increasing the granularity. How many deep balls does he throw to receivers who are separated? How many deep balls does he throw to receivers into a tight window? And it's just by adding that kind of extra layers of granularity, you can get a broader picture of what people are doing and just consistently add layers of context to players' performance that perhaps will then speed up kind of the scouting process, speed up the analytics, the sort of overall video analysis process and those kind of things, just to complement what you're doing. But certainly those kind of people should be not just looking at things like DVOA, EPA. It's about investigating a broader volume of stats as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just kind of adding more context to what you're looking at. For those who don't know, can you kind of explain DVOA and what that is?
As I understand it, it's like defense adjusted value over average, which basically is, it's trying to give context to, in often case, a quarterback's performance based upon the quality of the defenses that he faces. And so for a quarterback who plays a lot of strong defenses, he's going to be rated better in DVOA than a quarterback who faces more of an easier schedule. And so again, it's just trying to add context and just trying to say it's not as simple as kind of everyone plays the same 16-game schedule. It is guys have different challenges, guys face different defenses, and let's try and adjust for that within their statistics and within those outputs.
So it's like saying Tom Brady went, undefeated in his division, but he's playing the Dolphins, Jets, and Bills, whereas Jimmy Garoppolo is playing the Rams, Cardinals, and Seahawks. So that makes sense. Exactly. Matt, on the flip side, why do you prefer using old school, points allowed versus points scored, as opposed to EPA or DVOA?
I just think it's that old school bully mentality, but again, that's not foolproof either. It presents some of the same problems that I have with advanced stats. For me, advanced stats came about primarily for Major League Baseball. And in that regard, it's really easy to keep track of. You have one ball, you have a pitcher, you have a batter, you have a fielder. So say you hit it to left field, the left fielder commits an error, runner gets to third. There's a small amount of moving parts there. Now, in the NFL, you have 22 guys going at it at the same time. And to kind of evaluate everything with that many moving pieces, I feel leaves much more room for error as opposed to baseball. So it's not that I blindly prefer old school stats. I just think that in conjunction with the limitations of advanced metrics, you can look at something like, point differential as something to kind of supplement that, or the other way around, where I would use advanced stats to supplement the point differential. There are some stats that are kind of useless. The quarterback rating, who even knows what that is? I mean, it's terrible. It doesn't take into account nearly enough. It's a limited stat. So for me, the reason why I like point differential is if you can go out there and bully people around, you look at the 49ers, they averaged 10 points more than their opponents per game. I mean, a double-digit win differential per game. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, I like that you touched on quarterback rating, because it's always changing. It went from quarterback rating or passer rating to QBR, and it's just who knows what exactly it takes to get. Now it's a little more clear with QBR, but back when it was passer rating, it was 136 or whatever, 132.6, whatever the highest was, and it's like, what exactly does a guy need to do to get that? Sometimes a guy would play a really good game and get like a 90 something. So
and don't even get me started on the college one where it's like I think it's out of like 200 points or something like that. You see like Baker Mayfield, like Joe Burrow just had like a 193 quarterback rating. Like, what is that? Why is it different in college? I don't get it at all. It's a useless stat. It's a dumb one. I mean, you could throw it out there if you're trying to make an argument, like I always do with Cam Newton, just because I don't think he's that good. But it is a very limiting stat and doesn't take into account, especially with mobile quarterbacks, the amount that they add to the game with their legs and their athleticism. So it's something to throw out there if you're being a little bit cheeky, but in reality, it's not a great stat at all, and there are obviously better ones to use.
Next up on Niners News.
Matt, looking back on previous teams that have gone to the Super Bowl and lost it, and then the year after that, what indicators are there to kind of feel what is in store for the 49ers this season?
Well, you see that the well-run organizations typically tend to hover around playoff contentions and get back to where they are. Think of the Patriots, think of some other teams that have lost Super Bowls and come back the very next year. And you see the bad teams like the Los Angeles Rams, who put their entire cap into 3 players who don't even make the playoffs. For the 49ers, a make it or break it, I don't know exactly what that means. Are we talking about winning the Super Bowl? We're talking about making it back to the playoffs. I think making it back to the playoffs should be an acceptable outcome for this next season. You want to make sure that they don't have this severe drop off, and that they can be competitive, because let's face it, it's hard to get to the Super Bowl. Even if you win it, it's hard to get back. Tom Brady and Bill Belichick notwithstanding, it's not normal for teams to always be in the Super Bowl hunt. It's just not. You think about the Kansas City Chiefs. They hadn't made the Super Bowl since Super Bowl V before this. So even a well-run organization like the Chiefs is going to struggle to get back there. We just need to make sure that the 49ers are still in contention, and I think that John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan have them in a really good position cap-wise, with the way they've kind of layered their players between veterans and young guys, that they can keep the competitive window open for a while.
Interesting. I like how you broke that down, based on teams like the Rams or teams like the Patriots. It's kind of, everyone kind of views it as success, I guess, differently. Scott, how would you view it as a break it season? How do you define that?
As far as definitions, I think, again, it is, getting into playoff contention. I do wonder. I mean, obviously, everyone ultimately wants to win the Super Bowl, and I do wonder whether we'll get a better chance. I mean, obviously, it's hard to predict looking forward, but when you look at the way the roster is constructed right now, whether this is basically the best chance they're going to get for another couple of years after this. Traditionally, kind of when you look at the stats of teams returning to the Super Bowl, most teams drop out of the playoffs 2 years after a Super Bowl loss. A number will maybe drop out for a year and then get back, but others might have 2 years of playoff success and then drop out. So it tends to be kind of a 2 or 3 year window in which teams can kind of make the playoffs consistently and then try and get into the Super Bowl. Because it's obviously a very different ball game once you get to that point. But I think for the 49ers, when you look at how they've constructed the roster, the way that John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan have basically prioritized defense, because they trust that Kyle Shanahan is some kind of offensive whiz. He's a genius. He can create offense with not necessarily the highest caliber of player, whereas they've tried to sort of stack the defense with talent. One of the most important parts of the defense is the secondary, and that's an area that we may be about to see a substantial amount of turnover on after the season. It's Richard Sherman. He's not getting any younger. He's coming to the end of his contract. Is he going to want a last big payday? Is he going to be worth that amount of money to the 49ers by the end of the season? Who knows? Jaquiski Tartt is another one. Will he come back, or has them paying Jimmy Ward kind of put pay to their ability to pay another safety? Will they have to replace him with Harris or Moore or another player? I think even K'Wan Williams, his contract might be expiring as well. We still don't really know who Emmanuel Mosley is. We've got Akilla Witherspoon, whose contract is expiring. There's a lot of question marks in the secondary, and you do wonder, well, I know they've been prioritizing pass rush, and they did very well to replace Button with Kinlaw. That was a great kind of window opening move, I think. But I do think that on the back end, at least, the 49ers have got questions that will mean that for them this year could be a make it or break it year as far as getting back and being in genuine Super Bowl contention.
I think the thing that stuck out to me from your answer the most is within 2 years, teams are kind of out of the playoff hunt. And for me, I think that's how I would define this, is if they do not make it and or win the Super Bowl this year, is this their last chance for another couple of years before you get into that next cycle of, rebuilding and getting, closer each year? because we've all agreed they were a year early last season. But what does that mean in terms of their trajectory and in terms of their lifetime length span, so to speak? Because does that mean that it's shortened now by a year because they were a year early? So it's tough for me because the way I think about it is you both agreed the main goal should be to get to the playoffs. What if they lose in the wild card round? Is that still a successful year for you guys? Matt, you can go first.
Overall, I would say that probably would be. And just to add on to what Scott was saying about the defense coming up, with word coming out that from George Kittle's agent that he wants wide receiver money, this could be the last year of George Kittle too. I mean, to be honest, I don't know that the 49ers have 15 to 17 million to toss into a tight end, which is unfortunate because of how important he is. But if you view this regime running this team like the Patriots are run, where you cycle talent in and you maybe get rid of a guy a year too early than a year too late, maybe they can keep the window of contention open. And there have been times where Tom Brady may have lost in the divisional round, where he didn't get to the Super Bowl. But the thing that you want to have is sustained excellence. So you might not necessarily win or get to the Super Bowl every year, but if you're always floating around that 10, 11, 12 wins, you're going to get there eventually just by the law of averages. Really, you want to build a strong foundation and then accessorize as needed, given your cap situation, given the players available, given your draft positioning and the assets that you have there. And what your goal is to maintain a viable franchise long-term. And, it's easy to put, like the Rams did, go all in for a Super Bowl in 1 year, but that's really short-sighted because it leaves you short. So if the 49ers got to the playoffs and eventually bowed out in the wild card round, it would be disappointing just because we know how talented this team is. But if you trust in this regime to build the team the right way, there's no reason why they can't cycle some players out, get some new ones in. And as long as the scheme and the strategy for team building is sound between Lynch and Shanahan, there's no reason why they shouldn't be a perennial playoff contender every year.
I'm so glad you touched on George Kittle because that's a huge aspect. This team, we saw how they performed without George Kittle for a few games last year, and I don't know how they'd look without him permanently. It would be a huge loss for not only the offense but for the whole team. Scott, let me ask you the same question I just asked Matt. If they made it to the playoffs, to a wild card round and lost, is that still a successful year in your view?
No, I think it probably would be, as Matt said, I think it would be a disappointment because we know how talented they are. We know that this was a team, as Matt said in a previous show, that was blowing teams out, was averaging a substantial size of victory over their opponents. And for that team to sort of basically lose Buckner, one player, and then potentially reinforce the offense and potentially have better health on the offensive side of the ball, not lose an offensive tackle, not lose Kittle, not lose Juice, for that team to only get to the wildcard round, I think would be a letdown. I also just wanted to touch on a little bit on what you said earlier about arriving a year too early. I actually think when you look at the way the roster was constructed, they arrived right on schedule. Kind of, we knew going into last season that Jimmy Garoppolo being injured was creating kind of a real artificial floor and an artificial ceiling on what this offense could be. And then obviously when we knew that the defense, when they added Nick Bosa, we already felt, I think a lot of people felt that the defense was talented enough to have been making a better push than it was. And that by adding kind of one is essentially one of the best defensive ends in the NFL, by adding that took the defense to a whole new level. So I don't actually know whether they arrived a year too early. And that is my main concern, is that, to Matt's point about kind of viability, this year's draft was made more difficult by the Emmanuel Sanders trade. By losing those mid-round picks, by knowing you needed to replace Sherman, probably you potentially need to replace Tarr, and then obviously this Kittle situation, your ability to add sort of high-end potential replacement talent in this year's draft was significantly lessened by that trade, losing those mid-round picks. Obviously, then they did the Buckner trade. They traded for Kinlaw. That then enabled them to add a high-end talent for cheap, potentially get left more money, allowed them to re-sign Armstead and Ward. So they've done things to move around. But I still think that there's a question mark over kind of, if they don't do well this year, how quickly can they get that new talent in and recycle in, and how quickly will that new talent be ready to start be performing on the level that we've seen from the guys who we're potentially expecting to depart? And that's the big question for me. Perhaps this does mean that if we don't do it this year, they'll have a year out of the playoffs, but then it's going to be, contingent on Lynch. I think Matt's right to say that we need to trust them to essentially cycle through talent and be able to identify replacement level players who can perform ahead of or performing in place of the guys that were expected to depart, and that's their job. And I don't think we have any reason to doubt that based on how well they've recruited so far.
Okay, Matt, let me ask you this. In terms of make it or break it, we're talking about the team success from a kind of like a player standpoint. What about from a team building and a coaching standpoint? Are questions going to start to be raised about Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch if the 49ers take a step back this season?
It's hard to say that about Lynch because you look at what he's done to get talent surrounded. Now, whether that's Adam Peters or whether that's John Lynch himself or whether that's Kyle Shanahan kind of interjecting and telling him exactly what he wants, because we know that Kyle will flex his voice when he feels he needs to, that remains to be seen. But for Kyle Shanahan, I would say that some of the coaching gaffes that he has made, where he tends to outthink himself in late game situations. You know, sometimes he gets a little too cute. Sometimes he gets a little too basic. He goes away from what's working. Those are the things that you kind of want to see him clean up on. I don't believe he has a very good record in challenges. Maybe he needs to take a look at that, maybe get a little bit better at that. Obviously, everybody can improve. And I think that that is something that needs to happen for this team to, you know, kind of continue forward. Ultimately, the players execute what the coach puts out there. And if the execution isn't good, well, then the execution's not good. And so there's a limit on how much you can put on Shanahan and Lynch. Ultimately, the players have to play. You hope that the injury bug kind of swings back in their direction. I think the law of averages, they're kind of due for a healthy season, which would be huge for them. They've been one of the hardest hit teams in the NFL over the last couple of years. The one I can think of off the top of my head. The other one would be the Chargers, who have just been decimated by injuries year after year. So you'd like to see some healthy players out there, so that way you're not cycling through 5 offensive linemen in the middle of the season. You know, you don't lose Weston Richburg again late in the season. So the coaching, it's important, but temper your expectations on how much that truly affects the game beyond play calling.
Next up on Niners News.
Scott, they had a historically great year last season, specifically in their passing defense. Are they due for a decline?
I don't think necessarily. I think one of the things that's driven that has been kind of statistic stuff saying defense is an unstable thing. The 49ers have to regress because they were so good last season. And I think the only time you're kind of due to regress is when you're unsustainably good at, in defense's case, kind of a few different things probably. And I don't think there was really any point where the 49ers were unsustainably good at anything. The 49ers didn't have an unsustainably high pressure rate, which is quite a consistent statistic normally. If they can repeat their pressure rate, and if they can repeat their pressure rate with Dee Ford consistently healthy, then I think there's no reason to consider there'll be a drop off there. Interceptions and things like that may be kind of more touch and go, but their kind of QB schedule in the next season isn't the scariest quarterback schedule. So there's no reason to believe that they can't kind of similarly perform at a good level on defense in terms of turnovers. So I mean, in terms of unsustainably high performance, I don't think they're in that kind of situation, which doesn't to me suggest that they should have to regress from where they were. And then it's just a question of kind of, is defense so unstable that they're bound to be worse? But you have to ask yourself, why is defense unstable? And it's unstable because, unlike offense, which is primarily kind of driven by one position, there's more kind of constituent parts which have a higher degree of importance. So when people get injured, then you see instability because the quality of players dropped off. But in the 49ers case, they already dealt with a ton of injuries on the defensive side of the ball. They missed both starting safeties, missed time, starting cornerback missed time, a starting linebacker missed time. They had defensive linemen were rotating through. There's not kind of the suggestion that they kind of can't play through injuries. And in fact, you'd actually argue, as Matt said in our previous show, that there's a decent chance that the 49ers are actually going to be luckier with injuries than they were last season, based, again, that's just a luck thing. So if they're not going to be suffering because they're losing personnel, you're kind of questioning then, okay, so what else drives instability? Well, maybe departures. And I think the big question is basically what's going to happen with DeForest Buckner leaving? And are other players going to step into the breach? Are other players going to improve their performance? Or are we going to see a drop-off basically because DeForest Buckner has dropped out of the team? Because otherwise, in terms of other factors that can drive a decline in defensive performance, the 49ers look pretty well placed to kind of continue to play at a high level.
Matt, Scott touched on there, Matt. there wasn't really substantially high of a level play to where it should be too hard for them to follow up. Would you disagree on the fact that they were historically great in the pass defense? Isn't that kind of hard to follow up on, or at least repeat?
They were historically great on the pass defense, mainly because of that defensive line keeping the pressure on quarterbacks. And for me, that's something, I mean, they lost Buckner, but replacing Buckner with Kinlaw and getting a healthy D Ford, to me, that's a wash. And I think that the defensive line is still going to be deep. You talk about injuries that Scott touched on. You talk about Ronald Blair injured, Kentavious Street injured, DJ Jones injured, D Ford couldn't stay healthy. Quan Alexander missed 8 or 9 weeks. You talk about Richard Sherman even missed a game. The defense got hit with so many injuries last year that even just a marginal improvement in, a lessening of games missed due to injury is going to, keep them right there. Also, we can't overlook the offense's effect on the defense. If the offense gets a little bit better with people like Brandon Ayuk coming in, year 2 of Deebo Samuel, maybe Jet McKinnon makes, a splash there. Offensive line health, Kyle Juszczyk stays healthy. Again, George Kittle stays healthy. Then you're talking about an offense that's going to keep the ball, extend drives, keep the defense off the field, and keep them from getting gassed. And we all know what Robert Saleh likes to say, all gas, no brakes. If you have the gas in the tank, come the third and fourth quarter, they're going to continue to bully those offensive linemen and make them tired because, let's face it, the 49ers run 7-8 players deep on that defensive line once you consider all those players coming back from injury, and you can run people on a rotation. Now you're always rotating the fresh guy in, and you can sustain that pressure over the course of a game, and that's going to make the pass defense better. We do know that Richard Sherman did get picked on a little bit at the end, and maybe he's a little bit more reputation than he is absolute superstar, but he knows what he's doing. He's a high IQ player. Ahkello Witherspoon missed a bunch of time. If he can stay in there, keep his head right, not, get too down on himself, because I do think that he does have confidence issues. He played well at times last year. And then, of course, Emmanuel Mosley is there. People forget about Tim Harris Jr., who had a redshirt year. He's going to be back. So there's plenty of players there that can make plays. You just want to see that, again, it's health. Health is a huge thing, and the 49ers got hit badly. So considering what they did last year at a historic level, considering the injuries they had, absolutely it's sustainable for me.
Okay. Yeah. This team has just been bitten by the injury bug year after year. It seems like, even going back to previous coaching, trees and coaching staffs, I don't know what it is. I remember they got rid of Mark Uyami, I believe is how you say his name. He was kind of their head of health and medical services, so to speak. And they got rid of him thinking maybe it was something to do with him. But no, they just can't seem to escape the injury bug. For me, I don't think they're due for a decline, but I also wouldn't expect them to perform to as high of a standard as they did last season, even though their bread and butter is their defensive line, and even though they reinvested in their defensive line with Javon Kinlaw after shipping DeForest Buckner out to Indianapolis. It's still just a very high bar that they set. I wouldn't expect them to be nearly as high, but I do expect them to kind of come to the same level, so to speak. Scott, they, like I said, reinvested in the defensive line. Do you expect their sack numbers to go up, down, stay the same? How do you view their defensive line and their kind of impact on the game?
I actually think the sack numbers could go up. They weren't extraordinarily high last season. I think the pressure rate was good. But the sack numbers weren't kind of phenomenal. They weren't, when you look at the NFL sack table for teams, they weren't flying out in top. I think the key is that D Ford. I think when you look at the numbers with D Ford and without D Ford, it's a kind of a very, very different set of stats, basically. And you could see the impact on opposition teams of having to worry about his speed on the edge. And then that created a dilemma in how they were going to try and pass block. And I just think that the reality is, I think, with the sack number as well, is with more healthy DBs, with Jimmy Ward back, I think that's huge on things like third down, because a lot of quarterbacks like to work kind of between the numbers on third down. With him being able to kind of drop down and play man-to-man in there, I think that's a big difference. I think they've still got K'Wan Williams. If Fred Warner takes another step, I mean, he's already went from like kind of a middling coverage linebacker to maybe one of, if not the best coverage linebacker in the NFL last season. You look at that team, you think the quarterback's still going to be able to hold the ball, and the defensive line, if they're healthy, can, I think, actually improve on their sack numbers from last season.
That would be something to see because they were all over the backfield last season. And, guys like Nick Bosa, Dee Ford, even Armstead, they were just blowing up every single play, it seemed like. Matt, same question to you, but swap out sacks for interceptions. No one guy really had a high number of interceptions. They were a really, really good secondary in terms of, defending passes, but nobody was really taking them back. Do you see that number, going up or going down?
It's not like they were huge in interceptions. I believe they had 10 in the regular season, somewhere around there. But to Scott's point, third down is going to be a big down for them. And because the 49ers can gain so much pressure just off of rushing down linemen, that they weren't a heavy blitzing team, which means you have more to put in the defensive backfield. Maybe a tip or two here goes a little bit better. Maybe it doesn't. I think that interceptions in conjunction with pass breakups is more important than just interceptions by itself. Yes, you want to force turnovers. Yes, you would like to do some of those things and get turnovers, get good field position, maybe turn it around. Those things will come. I know that forced fumbles was a big thing for them last year. That helped them out a lot. But again, being tied to these specific numbers, you want to see the unit work together as a whole. So sacks could go up. Maybe by sacks going up, there's more pressure around the quarterback. Maybe the quarterback gets a little more skittish, throws something he shouldn't, and in turn, interceptions go up. They're all interwoven into each other, and the better that one aspect plays, the more it raises up the other, and vice versa. So as long as the team can play at a consistently high level as in terms of effort, because we know they have the talent. It's just about the effort and not coming out flat as they did a couple of times this year, especially in first quarters where they would give up a long drive. Particularly the Rams game comes to mind. They had to get punched in the mouth before they said, okay, that's enough. So we know they can shut teams down. But having that consistent effort, having that smooth communication between the two, like Scott said, another step forward maybe from Fred Warner, who is turned out to be an incredible draft pick for the 49ers. Maybe an extra step forward by somebody like Dre Greenlaw, some who can take another step forward. Javon Kinlaw, who knows? He can come in. Maybe he's a plug and play guy right away. Dee Ford being healthy. All these things can combine together. And when the team and the personnel are together and playing well, then the stats are going to come one way or another.
I love that, they take Javon Kinlaw 14 overall, and it's very rare that a guy is taken that high up and not much is expected of him his first year. I think that speaks to where this defense and specifically this defensive line is as a whole, that they could take a guy that early in the draft and they can essentially use that as a buffer year for him to get comfortable and then expect more out of him his sophomore year. I think the main points we touched on this though is health. They should be getting healthier, which is huge. 2, the bar wasn't set too high to the point that they can't replicate those that performance. 3, they're getting younger guys to kind of rotate in, and 4, some of these younger guys are having another year in the system. So and most importantly, these things are interconnected. They're interwoven. Like you said, depends how the offense plays. Really impacts how the defense plays. If the offense is going 3 and out, throwing interceptions, that defense is winded. You can't expect them to come out there and be stout and shut down first, second, and third down every play. They need to get some rest. So a lot of these things are interconnected. Sacks, pressures turn into more interceptions or, padded down passes. So all of these things kind of need to help each other out in all aspects. So exactly. I think we all agree. Yeah, I think we can all agree the defense isn't due for a decline, but they do have a lot on their plate that they need to kind of continue.
There's also one more important aspect that we need to look at. And this goes back to the earlier conversation about a make it, break it, maybe Super Bowl hangover year. There's two mentalities that this team can come out with. They can come out like the Rams and defeated, or they can come out pissed off. And knowing Kyle Shanahan, this team is going to come out pissed off. Knowing Robert Saleh, they're going to come out pissed off. And a pissed off team with this much talent, league better watch out.